again, and welcome to War Stories, behind the scenes tales from the front lines of the media. I'm your host, Tom Curley. Welcome to the show. And as we have to do every week, for those of you that are just tuning in and have never heard the show before, what is the show? Well, I used to be a TV director for the CBS television network for about 40 years. I was also an audio guy and a TD, and I have a lot of stories of stuff that happened behind the scenes, behind the scenes, and they're funny. And I couldn't do it without my partner in crime here, the inimitable Garry Armstrong, the veteran Boston TV reporter of 30 plus years, who has a lot of stories in front of the camera. Garry, how the hell are you today?
I think I'm doing okay. Just a couple of warnings. I was trying to subdue the belches and other things that your body does to you without warning. And I must also warn you that Duke is outside warming up his audience. We've locked him out. He has a dish of water, but I think he's trying to get his audience for the show he puts on. Otherwise, we're as I said last week, we're
We're
right as rain and ready to roar.
right, right as rain and ready to roll. Well, we had a lot of fun with last week's show. Where we finally got to the Yul Brynner story. And we did get a lot of positive comments from it. A lot of people saying, yeah, it was worth the wait. It was pretty funny. And again, it fit our format. And, you can't make this stuff up. And the graphics department had a lot of fun. They're becoming more and more wordy all the time. Yeah, yeah. So, before we start, I am happy to say that we have another commercial coming up with our sponsor, the Long John Sump Pump and Bassinet Society. We'll be getting to that in a few minutes. But I know, I'm excited. They're excited. We're all excited. Now, not as excited as episode 13, but we're excited. So anyway, we don't really have a lot of stuff to a lot of I've lost the ability to speak. I've lost the ability to speak. Stuff to deal with from previous weeks. So let's jump right in. Uh, Last week's show was about the Yul Brynner story, which involved, for some reason, people constantly singing "Some Enchanted Evening."
Some enchanted evening.
And you have a story apparently about Mitzy Gaynor, who actually was in South Pacific, as
Yes,
opposed to Yul Brynner, who in fact wasn't. So what's that all about?
Mitzi Gaynor, back in the early '70s, was one of the performers at the South Shore Music Circus in Cohasset, Massachusetts. I don't even know whether they're still doing that, but she was there almost every summer. And one of her topics that she would make available was the movie version of South Pacific. And of course, the big song, if it is the biggest song from that movie, was Some Enchanted Evening. To give you the setting, we would do our interviews, and this is the middle of the summer now. We would do our interviews on the top of the roof of the luxurious Copley Plaza Hotel. That's a top scale hotel in Boston. And it was like a millionaire setting. I mean, they had the beach chairs and they had the pool and they had the waiters coming in with anything that you wanted. And it was a pristine setting to do the interview. And Mitzi was, she was so sweet. She was lovely. I was brand new in Boston then. And she did everything she could to make the things go smoothly, and they did. Now, I should add, Tom, that the cameraman for most of these Gaynor interviews was a fellow named Hal Nielsen. Now, he's the guy who shot that infamous Jerry Lewis interview that we talked about a couple of podcasts ago. Now, Hal, he must have been in his 50s or 60s back then. I was barely into my 30s, and of course, anyone over 40 seemed old. But the point I'm trying to make is that Hal had been in the business from the 1930s. He had begun shooting stills and then film, black and white film, silent and then sound. And he was the one when we went from film to videotape, ENG, electronic news gathering. Hal was the one who said, Uh, this is a passing phase. It'll never work. It's a piece of junk. It's garbage. Say goodbye to video. Hal was that kind of guy. He was also, um, he was a lovable soul. He had a very deep voice, and he was a Manhattan fan. And it was known throughout the business that if Hal went to lunch before he shot his news pieces, that meant he was going to have three Manhattans. I'm sorry, and he would be useless. And I'm a fine person to say that, but I'm setting the backdrop to that. So as we were setting up the interview with Mitzy Gaynor, and Hal was fussing around with the lights and the camera and so forth, Mitzi was singing "Some Enchanted Evening." Hal, in the middle of putting up the covering for the camera, turned around and walked over to Mitzi Gaynor and said, "Mitzi, I love that song," and he joined her in singing "Some Enchanted Evening."
Some enchanted evening.
At one point, I had to walk over and say, "Time's over, folks. We have to do the interview." So Mitzi walked into the interview chair. She sat down, spread out her skirt, and she said, "Can we sing Some Enchanted Evening one more time?" And I said, "Mitzi, I don't think so. I love your work, and that was a wonderful movie." And she started in with some war stories about the shoot of Some Enchanted Evening.
Some enchanted evening.
Played the role on the film. I keep thinking of Ezio Pinto, who of course did it on stage. But I finally had to get Mitzi Gaynor to stop singing Some Enchanted Evening.
Some enchanted evening.
Now, at that point, we had not gotten to do the Burt Reynolds, Hugh Brenner fuzz story that I think we did in the last week's show. So there must have been some karma upstairs in TV heaven saying to me, "We're going to get you with Some Enchanted Evening." We finished doing the interview and we were shooting cutaways. And behind me, I could hear this deep baritone. My my father cameraman, Hal Nielsen, was singing "Some Enchanted Evening."
Some enchanted evening.
And Mitzi Gaynor, without looking at me, turned to Hal and said, "Hal, bring it up a little bit, and I'll join you in." So, can you imagine? Cutaways are being shot, and Mitzi Gaynor and this old geezer for a cameraman, they're singing "Some Enchanted Evening," and
Some enchanted evening.
I wasn't flustered. I was just looking at the camera, looking at Mitzi Gaynor, and then looking at Hal Nielsen and wondering what is this going to be about? Are we going to be able to use it? Well, long story short, we ran what you would call the rough version of the interview with everything in there, and it went over big. It went over big. People were singing "Some Enchanted Evening" in the newsroom to the point where the news director came out and said, "This is a business. This is not show business. This is news." And somebody said, "What do you think this news is? It's show business." And as he walked away, somebody yelled, "Doofus." And he turned around and looked at me, and I said, "I didn't say that. This time I didn't say it." Then, as the news director walked away, I started singing.
Some enchanted evening.
He turned around and glared at me, walked into his office, and slammed the door. And he slammed it so hard that the door flew back in his face. And everyone laughed. And someone in a far corner of the newsroom started singing, "Some
Some
Enchanted
enchanted
Evening." So
evening.
Mitzi Gaynor, she continued that legend. That was, I couldn't believe it. But you've worked with people who started in our business all those years ago, and they have these stories that make you feel like a kid because they did work with pioneers in movies and pioneers in radio and pioneers in television. And when they we have to put this in the past tense now, when they spun their stories, they seem bizarre, just like our stories seem bizarre today.
Oh, yeah. One of the reasons I started this show, um, there was a brief period of time I hope I haven't said this in previous episodes. I might have, and if I did, I apologize. Um, there was a brief period of time where I was in between shows. I had no assignment. And one of the problems that we had on the morning news was we were constantly getting music groups. All right. And, we were a news show, but, the morning shows, I think probably Good Morning America started doing it, so we had to do it. But the point was, we would always have to run down to the equipment crib and get all sorts of extra equipment. Stage amplifiers, speakers, PA systems, feedback suppressors, reverb machines, so that we could do the band properly. And then I had the idea that, I said, why don't I go down to the equipment crib and assign me there for a month? And I will just take roll around racks, and I will insert a feedback suppressor, a couple of amplifiers, some speakers you can put on the top, um, uh, compressors, all the equipment that you would need to do a band. And I would put it in I would build a little patch bay so that all you had to do is just roll it out of the crib, roll it onto the set, everything would already be plugged in,
Right.
boom, and it would save us literally hours of of you know preparation. So they said, sure, fine.
Right.
So I used to sit in the back room of the equipment crib, just wiring stuff together. Now, I wasn't very good at it. I mean, I wasn't. We had a construction department who put together, when they put together, well, they built the entire broadcast center, and everything was a work of art. Every wire was the perfect size, and everything, fit perfectly. And mine
Yeah.
was just a hodgepodge, but it worked. And
That's all that
it was
matters.
sort of mindless. It was mindless work, but the equipment crib is where all the techs hung out when they didn't have an assignment, and especially the
Hmm.
old guys, because the guy that ran the crib at
Ah.
that time was one of the what we call the old timers, people who are our age, well, 50s, 60s, who had started in radio in the 40s and the 30s, then went to television in the 50s, and they actually invented television. These were the guys
Yes.
that started television. So, and they would tell all these great stories. Like, for instance, one of the guys was the cameraman. Um, he was the cameraman who was there. He was the guy on the air when Jack Ruby shot Oswald. He was the cameraman.
Oh,
It
my
was a
good.
pool feed. Um,
That's
Another one
incredible.
was the guy who was, I know, the other one was a guy who was at Cape Canaveral. Um, or also with Walter Cronkite when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. Um, the audio guy who recorded the Beatles, and he was on the board in the Beatles, and Ed Sullivan, and Elvis Presley. Now, and I would sit there and go like, oh my God, you know, you did the Beatles? And he went, yeah, I think I did. I'm pretty sure that was the night that Steve and Edie Gourmet were on. That's all he remembered.
Yeah.
But they all went, I said, guys, you were there for history. And they went, it's just another day at work. And I'd always thought, and I regret to this day, I meant to just, I was in the equipment crib, all right? I could just take
Uh-huh.
a microphone and a tape recorder, and I just should have recorded these stories, okay?
Absolutely.
Because they were fantastic. And it was that experience that has always been in the back of my head that actually gave me the idea to start this show. For instance, um, one of the guys worked on the Jackie Gleason show, all right? And he worked on the original one. There was two. But everybody remembers the
Hmm.
second one, the one that was done in Miami, all right? And, with the Jim
Right.
Taylor dancers and Joe the bartender and the weird guy that was always drunk. And then suddenly he would sing,
Right.
"On the
Right.
Enchanted Evening,"
Some enchanted evening.
Um, but anyway, uh, uh, Gleason was one of the few people that had incredible power uh, at 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 CBS. Uh, uh, Ed
Yes.
Sullivan was one. Jack Benny was one. Believe it or not, Arthur Godfrey was another. Except nobody remembers Arthur
He
Godfrey, but
was.
at the time he was God. Okay, so apparently the board of directors wanted him. The network wanted him to do another show, and he didn't want to do a show. So the first thing he did is he decided that he would simply make so many outrageous demands that eventually they'd give up. and they'd leave him alone. So his first demand was that he wanted to do the show in Miami, not New York. I went, okay. The next demand, he said, all right, I want to, I'm afraid, I don't like flying. I want to train. I want to go by train. They went, yeah, okay, fine. There's no, I want my own private train car. I went, okay, fine. Said, I want my New York crew. I want my New York crew to do the
Wow.
show. They said, okay, fine. Said, I want you to buy houses for them in Florida. They said, okay, fine. So apparently he said, after a while he had to do the show because they simply said yes to every single
They kept
demand.
saying
So
yes.
he had no choice. And that show went on for, I don't know, maybe 10 years, or about, I mean, it went on for a long time. So I mean, I thought that was actually fascinating. So before we get on to the next story, we have to take a commercial break because we have a commercial. We have gotten to the point we
Yes.
have a sponsor,
Yes.
the Long John Sun Pump and Bassinet Society, who is a record collection thing. Vinyl is very big with kids today, and it's not just music; it's also the spoken word. So we'll be back right after these words.
Hello. Are you one of those busy yet culturally aware people who would like to attend the classical theater but don't because it's too expensive? Do you feel that Shakespeare is basically long and boring and nobody really understands what anybody is saying anyway? Well, if you are one of those people, then we have just the thing for you. Static House, a division of the Long John Sump Pump and Bassinet Society, is offering you the next in our No Time for the Classics series. No Time for Shakespeare. Yes, on just 2 albums, you will hear the complete works of William Shakespeare. How do we do it? Simple. We perform them really fast. You'll hear Hamlet,
Speak the speech I pray you, as I pronounced it to you, trivially on the tongue.
King Lear,
How fares, Your Majesty?
You do me wrong to take me out of the grave.
Romeo and Juliet,
Oh, Romeo, Romeo. Wherefore art thou, Romeo?
and much, much more. Remember, that's No Time for Shakespeare. And here's your announcer to tell you how to order.
Dial 1-900-SHAKESPEARE. That's 1-900-SHAKESPEARE. And remember, the quality of mercy is not spoiled because we add BHT to preserve freshness.
You're going to regret this because that is so bad that it's good. It's going to make it. It's really going to make it. I have to warn you, Tom, that my hearing apps are in overdrive. Marilyn has told me that because I was complaining about this last night that I'm overmodulating. So that last commercial, the commercial, uh, is reverberating in my brain right now. That's a compliment. That's all.
The sad part,
Maybe we can get a commercial for hearing apps and batteries.
that could be. Believe it or not, the those are old commercials that I did many years ago with my partner Jeff Krause, who we both know very well, on a thing that we plug at the end of each show called a half-hour radio show. Um, I decided that hey, if I can't steal from myself, who can I? Now the ironic thing is, truly ironic, is that when that was made in the late '80s, the whole concept we just simply play them really fast was funny. But nowadays, do you know that on your audiobook apps, because I have hit it by accident uh, more than once, you can change the speed. You can change the speed
Oh,
that you
really?
listen to the audiobook at. You can listen to it at 1.1 and a half times as fast, twice as fast, 3 times as fast, half slow, and it adjusts the pitch so that the voice sounds the same. It just talks very fast. So I mean, we live in a society which has gotten so ADHD that you have to listen to an audiobook at double speed. I mean, good lord, give me
True.
a break. It's really, really, really sad.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a nice segue into a story that I've been holding for you. Actually, um, one of our viewers, who is also a regular follower of Marilyn's blog, reminded me about a Katharine Hepburn story that I had forgotten about. That's another, Tom, another barometer of the people we are reaching with this show, that they will go back and say, We like the show. They love your vest and your other apparel. But I was reminded of the Katharine Hepburn story talking about attitude. This happened in the short time between when I left ABC News and before I landed in Boston. I worked for a short time at a very small TV station in Hartford, Connecticut. It was so small that there were two people in the newsroom, the news director and me, and I wound up doing most of the work. I think that's why I got the job. But I was working in the newsroom in Hartford, Connecticut. The station, by the way, was located on Asylum Street, and that should have been an indicator. But I was working on a news script, and I got a call from the lobby, and I was told that I had a phone call. And people like to prank you and prank you and prank you. So you're always skeptical, excuse me, of people telling you you have a phone call from someone who's famous. So I picked up the phone, and the voice sounded very much like Katharine Hepburn, but I knew for sure that was I was being pranked again. And I said, "Okay, who is this? Who's doing this?" I thought it was Pete Savioli at first. The voice said, "No, This is Katharine Hepburn." And I said, I don't know who you are. You do a great imitation." And the voice said, "Of course I do a great imitation because I am Katharine Hepburn, and I'm calling you from my home, which is about 20 or 25 minutes from your television station." And of course, Katharine Hepburn, one of her homes, I think it's the place where she was born, was just outside of Hartford. So, long story short here, uh, once I was convinced that it could have been Katharine Hepburn, I received an invitation to go visit. Now, I was still skeptical, Tom. So I get in the car and I drive to the address. I knock on the door and I'm waited to be greeted by, some Yahoo from the TV station. Door opens and it's Katharine Hepburn. I stood there with my mouth wide open, and she said, "Mr. Armstrong, welcome." And I said, uh, thank you." And I walked in, and she said, "I'm so glad you could make it." And I said, "Well, I found time." And she said, "Well, why don't you sit down?" And I sat down, and I'm still thinking, there's something not quite right about this. This is an actress or somebody who's really, really trying to get to me. It was Katharine Hepburn. Once, once I was able to handle that, I sat back and I just relaxed, and she started talking, and she said, you know, a lot of us, and she was referring to major celebrities who have homes outside of New York and outside of Hollywood. They like to see who the local talent is, and that's why they tune in small TV stations. And she talked about my work, and she said, I like your attitude." And I said, "Really?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, there are a lot of people who told me they don't like my attitude." And then she said, "Well, you know what, Mr. Armstrong, may I call you Garry?" And I said, "Oh, sure, you can call me Garry." She said, "Garry, when people tell you you have a bad attitude, do what I did when I was working at RKO all those many years ago when they told me I was box office poison. Just ignore them. Just go on and keep doing what you're doing." "Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am." "No, don't call me ma'am. Call me Catherine. Call me Kate. Whatever." And she said, I noticed the way you write. I like that writing style. It's what we used back in the old days. RKO didn't like it, but I insisted we keep that style in my scripts because I like to work the way I talk, the way I write, the way I act. It's essentially who I am." And I said, "Well, Miss Hepburn, I told you to call me Kate." "Yes, yes, ma'am." "No, not ma'am." "Yes, yes." So she said, "How do you write your scripts?" I said, "I don't think." She said, "You don't think when you write?" And I said, "No, that isn't what I meant." And she started laughing at me. And she proceeded to talk about how she enjoyed newscasters, reporters who spoke the way they wrote, and vice versa. And she started chastising some of the people who were really big in the business back then. This was 1969, I believe. And I'm just listening as she's criticizing people that we admired. And then I'm listening, Tom. I'm not interfering with her at all. And then she lapses into Hollywood, and she's doing what we do. She's telling her own war stories. And she said, "By the way, I'm going to talk to you about your clothing in a minute because there are some things I've noticed. And please I don't mean to insult you, but I have a fine, keen eye for that. I used to have to straighten Spencer's tie. And it occurred to me she was talking about Spencer Tracy. And of course, she never talked about Spencer Tracy. And here she was talking to this, you know, this, this young reporter. And I'm thinking, where are we going with this? And she said, I like the way you have your tie knotted. Who did that for you? And I said, oh, I do all that myself. Before I leave the house, I do that. Well, she said, Spence never did that. And it so annoyed me. And she said, and when Spence used to leave the house, I had to make sure that his shirt was buttoned the right way. And she said, one day you'll never believe this. And I've never told anyone about this. And I said, I'm all ears. And she smiled and she said, yes, you are. She said, one day Spence was getting ready to leave the house and I noticed something. And she said, Spencer? And I said, well, what did he say? He just looked at me with his mouth wide open. I said, Spence, the garage door is open. And he said, oh, shit. And he looked down and his fly was open. And I'm thinking, I'm here in Katharine Hepburn's house and she's talking to me about Spencer Tracy walking out of their house with his fly uncovered. And I'm thinking, this is really bizarro. And she said, that's a true story. That really is a true story. So I couldn't, I couldn't know but ask the next question. Well, how often did he leave the house with his fly open? And she said, that's a good question. I don't know, but I think it was more than once. Yeah, you men must pay more attention to how you dress. And it's important that you zip your fly before you leave the house. And I said, I'm going to write that down. And she said, don't be funny with me. I said, no, 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 no. That's happened to me. And then she started telling me more stories about working with the people at MGM. And I'm sitting back and thinking, my God, I have to write a book about this. And she's going on and on. And at one point she said, I don't know why I'm telling you all of this, but there are people you can trust and people you can trust. And I have a feeling I can trust you. And she brought out cookies and tea and kept talking and talking. And she said, you haven't asked me any questions. I said, well, I don't mean to be rude, but you haven't allowed me. You've been talking all this time. And I said, the mark of a good reporter, Kate, is that he listens. And she said, I noticed that you've been listening. And I said, but I don't have any choice. And I said, I'll share something else with you. I'm hard of hearing, so I have to look at someone when they're talking to make sure I understand what's being said, lest I ask a very stupid question. And she said, that's really interesting. I never thought of it that way. And we went on for another hour with her talking about her various movies. And I mentioned one film that I'm really fond of. It's not very well done, and it's a Tracy Hepburn film called Sea of Grass. And we just watched it here a couple of weeks ago, and it was directed by Elia Kazan, one of his early movies, and it just didn't work. And how can you make a movie with Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn and have it be a dud? And she said, well, I have to tell you, Spence liked it. Spence wanted to work with Kazan because he was the go-to guy. He was working with some new kid named Brendo, she said. And so I said yes because I always said yes to Spence. And I said, well, maybe you should have said no. And she said, you're damn straight, Garry. You're damn straight. And I just smiled and we both laughed. And I looked at my watch and I said, I'm sorry I have to tell you this, but I need to get back to work. And she said, why? Why don't you have someone else in the newsroom do some of this work for you? And I said, there are only two of us. And she said, what do you mean? I said, there's the news director and there's me. And I have to do all the writing, or there won't be a newscast. And she said, that's ridiculous. And I said, yeah, but I think there's going to be something for me beyond Hartford, Connecticut. And she smiled and she said, yes. And she said, when you go back, you tell that newscaster that Katharine Hepburn thinks that this is really reprehensible behavior. I said, I could do that, but I don't think he'll believe me. I don't think anyone will believe that I'm having this conversation. And she said, well, that's show business for you. And she said, well, it's been good talking to you. Remember to check your wardrobe. That jacket doesn't fit you quite well. It's too snug there. And I said, yes, 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 yes. And she said, you don't like what I'm telling you, do you? And I said, you're Katharine Hepburn. You can tell me anything. And she said, God bless you. Now you can leave. And that was it. I walked out of the house thinking, I've just been sitting here with Katharine Hepburn, and it doesn't make any sense to me, but it's wonderful.
Hey, that's great. And we've been sitting here for a half hour, and we've done it again. We've run out the clock. Uh, we did have some other stories to get to, but we didn't get to them. We'll get to them next week. So, of course, now time for the mandatory plugs. The blog, I called it a podcast last week, and I was reprimanded by so many people that your wife Marilyn writes that we contribute to serendipity seeking intelligent life on Earth. Um, she's having a lot of fun posting our podcasts up there. She's very prolific. I was looking at her stats the other day. It's amazing how many people tune in. It is just crazy. And then,
It
of
blows
course,
my
also
mind.
My Audio Theater Group. My Audio Theater Group, Voicescapes Audio Theater for the best in comedy, audio comedy, and drama. And a half hour radio show, which is now sort of sneaking its way into this show. The podcast, which
Great.
was before podcasts existed, it was actually a syndicated radio show. It was from the 80s, and it's just as funny today as it was then. So, Gary, I don't know what else to say except some enchanted evening and see ya.
Some enchanted evening